Hi, my name is Alex, and today I want to share my story on how I became fluent in English. Trust me, it wasn't easy. But here's the thing. I didn't start out loving English. In fact, I kind of hated it. Weird, right? I guess that's where all good stories begin. With a struggle. When I was younger, English wasn't even on my radar. I grew up speaking another language, and to be honest, I thought English was something I'd never need. It was just another subject in school, like math or history, something to study for the sake of passing exams. But boy, was I wrong. It wasn't until I was about 12 that I realized just how important English could be. My parents told me we were moving to an English-speaking country, and suddenly the stakes got a lot higher. I remember feeling a pit in my stomach. I could barely string together a sentence, and now I had to live somewhere where people would expect me to speak fluently. I was terrified. On the first day of school in this new country, I felt like I had been dropped into a different world. Everyone around me was chatting away in English, laughing, and making jokes that I didn't understand. Even simple things like asking for directions or participating in class felt impossible. The worst part was feeling left out, like I was missing out on everything because of a language barrier. That was my first real motivation to learn English, not for grades or tests, but because I wanted to connect with people, to belong. I'll be honest, the first few months were rough. I was shy about speaking because I was afraid I'd embarrass myself. Whenever I tried to say something, I'd overthink it. Is this the right word? Am I using the right tense? What if I say something wrong and everyone laughs? Those thoughts held me back for a while. But eventually, I realized something important. Nobody really cared if I made mistakes. Sure, there were a few times people chuckled at my accent or my choice of words, but most of the time, they just wanted to understand me. That realization was freeing. So I started to take more risks. I began speaking to people in English whenever I could, even if I wasn't sure I was saying things perfectly. I'd make small talk with classmates, ask questions in class, and practice in front of a mirror when I was at home. It was awkward at first, but the more I did it, the more confident I became. One thing that really helped me improve was watching TV shows and movies in English. At first, I used subtitles in my own language, but after a while, I switched to English subtitles. This way, I could hear how native speakers talked and see the words on the screen at the same time. It felt like a light bulb went off in my head. I started picking up slang, new expressions, and even the rhythm of how people talked. It was fun too. I didn't feel like I was studying, but I was still learning. Another big turning point for me was reading. I know, reading sounds boring, but trust me, it helps. I started with simple books, like young adult novels or short stories. These were way more interesting than the dry textbooks I was used to. The stories kept me engaged, and I'd make a point to look up words I didn't understand. Over time, my vocabulary grew, and I noticed that I could follow conversations more easily. But it wasn't just about learning new words. Reading helped me understand grammar without having to think about it too much. When you read a lot, you start to notice patterns. You see how sentences are put together, and eventually, you just get a feel for what sounds right without having to remember a bunch of rules. That made speaking and writing in English a lot easier. Now, I'd be lying if I said there weren't any setbacks along the way. There were plenty of times when I felt frustrated, like I wasn't improving fast enough. Some days, I'd try to speak and feel like I was back at square one, stumbling over my words or forgetting something I thought I had already learned. But looking back, I realized that's just part of the process. You have to be patient with yourself. One of the hardest parts for me was learning how to think in English. For the longest time, I'd translate everything in my head from my first language to English before speaking, which slowed me down. It wasn't until I started forcing myself to think directly in English that things really started to click. At first, it felt weird, like I was talking to myself in a different voice. But over time, it became natural. I'd look at things around me, a tree, a book, a car, and immediately think of the English word for it. It was like rewiring my brain, but it made a huge difference. I also found that writing helped me improve faster. Whenever I wrote essays or short stories in English, I had time to think about the words I was using. I could experiment with different sentence structures and expressions. Writing gave me the space to make mistakes and learn from them without the pressure of having to speak in real time. I even started keeping a journal where I'd write about my day, my thoughts, or whatever came to mind. That not only helped with my English, but also made me feel more connected to the language on a personal level. One day, I realized something had changed. I was sitting in a classroom, listening to my teacher talk about a project, and I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I wasn't struggling to keep up. I understood everything, and when the teacher asked for volunteers to present their ideas, I raised my hand without even thinking. That was the moment I knew I had become fluent. Of course, that doesn't mean I stopped learning. Even now, I'm still picking up new words, phrases, and idioms. But the difference is, I'm no longer afraid. I don't hesitate when I speak, and I don't worry about making mistakes, because I know that's just part of learning. Becoming fluent in English wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, practice, and a lot of patience. But looking back, I wouldn't trade that journey for anything. It taught me so much about myself, not just as a language learner, but as a person. So, that's my story. If you're on your own journey to learn English, or any other language for that matter, my advice is simple. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Surround yourself with the language as much as you can, and most importantly, enjoy the process. It's not about being perfect. It's about progress. And trust me, if I can do it, so can you. Thanks for sticking around to hear my story. Honestly, as I sit here talking to you, I still can't believe how far I've come. It feels like just yesterday I was that nervous kid who could barely say hello without tripping over my words. But now, English feels like a second skin, something that's a part of me, just like my first language. And I don't mean that in some dramatic, over-the-top way. It's more like English became the way I see the world now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Where was I? Oh yeah, the moment I realized I had become fluent. I think that day in class, when I raised my hand without even thinking, that was a turning point. But there were still challenges ahead. Just because I was more comfortable with the language didn't mean I was done learning. In fact, I think that's when I realized that fluency isn't some magical finish line. It's more like a never-ending journey. There's always something new to learn, and that's what makes it exciting. After that, I started to push myself even more. I wasn't just learning English to survive in school anymore. I wanted to excel. I wanted to be able to express myself the way native speakers did, with all the little nuances, humor, and slang that make a language feel alive. That's when I started paying attention to how people around me really talked. Like, I'm talking about the way they joked, the way they casually told stories, the phrases they used that never show up in textbooks. One day, I was sitting in the cafeteria with some friends, and they were all cracking jokes. Some of it flew right over my head, but I was starting to get it. I remember one of them told this really lame joke about bananas. Don't ask me what it was, I've forgotten by now. But what I remember is that I laughed, like genuinely laughed, and added my own twist to the joke. And guess what? Everyone laughed too. That moment hit me hard. I wasn't just speaking English anymore. I was part of the conversation. I wasn't the quiet kid on the edge of the group, awkwardly nodding along. I was in it. But humor wasn't the only area where I saw myself improving. It was little things like ordering food at a restaurant without having to rehearse what I was going to say in my head first, or answering a question in class and not worrying if I sounded weird. Even my texting style changed. I started texting my friends in English, picking up on abbreviations, memes, and emojis that made me feel like I belonged in the conversation, even though I was still learning. At some point, I started noticing that my dreams were in English too. Weird, right? But it's true. I remember waking up one morning and realizing I had had an entire conversation with someone in English in my dream. It was so strange, but kind of amazing at the same time. It made me realize just how much my brain was adapting. Of course, there were still moments of doubt. Sometimes I'd have a conversation and totally blank on a word I knew I should know, or I'd mess up a tense and feel embarrassed. But here's what I've learned. Nobody is perfect. Even native speakers mess up all the time. I remember once I heard one of my English-speaking friends mix up there and there, and I thought, hey, if they can make mistakes and still be fluent, I'm doing just fine. One of the things that helped me get even better was making friends with people who didn't speak my first language. That forced me to rely on English all the time. It sounds intimidating, I know, but it was actually a lot of fun. We'd go to the movies, hang out after school, or play video games, and English became the bridge between us. In the beginning, I'd still get stuck, but my friends were super patient. They'd help me out, correct me when I needed it, and sometimes even teach me slang I would never learn in class. I remember this one time we were all playing an online game, and I had no idea what some of the terms meant. My friends started throwing around words like camping and noob, and I was completely lost. But instead of pretending to understand, I just asked, and they explained everything to me, laughing along the way. I started to realize that learning English didn't have to be a chore. It could actually be fun, especially when it was connected to things I already enjoyed. Over time, I noticed that I wasn't just learning English, I was living it. It became part of who I was, part of my everyday life. Whether I was talking to my friends, reading something online, or just thinking to myself, English was always there. It stopped being this foreign, intimidating thing and became just normal. There was this moment, about a year after we had moved, when I went back to visit my home country for the summer. I met up with some of my old friends, and that's when I realized how much had changed. We were all hanging out, and they were chatting away in our native language, but for some reason I kept slipping into English. Not on purpose, it just happened. I'd say something, and then everyone would look at me like, "Huh? What did you just say?" It was kind of funny, but also a little strange. It made me realize how much I had internalized the language. It had become second nature. And here's the wildest part. By the end of that summer, one of my friends pulled me aside and asked for advice on learning English. Me. The same kid who used to struggle with the simplest sentences was now giving tips to someone else. It was surreal, but also really cool. It made me realize just how far I'd come and how much of an impact learning a language can have on your life. So what's the moral of my story? I guess it's that fluency doesn't happen overnight. It's not about memorizing a bunch of words or getting perfect grammar on every test. It's about making the language a part of your everyday life. It's about embracing the awkward moments, the mistakes, and even the times when you feel completely lost. Because those are the moments when you're actually learning. And if I can offer one piece of advice to anyone learning English, or any language really, it's this. Don't be afraid to use it. Speak, even when you're unsure. Ask questions, even if they seem silly. Surround yourself with the language in any way you can, whether it's through music, movies, books, or conversations. And most importantly, enjoy the process. Because one day you'll look back just like I am now and realize how far you've come. And trust me, it's a pretty amazing feeling. You know, even as I sit here sharing my story with you, I still sometimes catch myself wondering, how did I even get here? I mean, not too long ago, English was this huge mountain I didn't think I'd ever be able to climb. And now it's just a part of me. It's wild, really. But I guess that's what happens when you put in the time and effort. Without even realizing it, you make progress. Let me tell you about a few more moments that really stood out to me along the way. One of the biggest ones happened when I was asked to give a presentation in class. You've got to understand, this was my worst nightmare when I first started learning English. The thought of standing in front of everyone speaking English and being judged for every mistake? Yeah, no thanks. But this time, something was different. When the teacher announced we had to present our research, I didn't feel that old wave of panic. I just thought, okay, let's do this. Now don't get me wrong. I wasn't suddenly some super confident public speaker. I still practiced my presentation about 100 times in front of the mirror, muttering to myself, tweaking my sentences, trying to get everything just right. But when the day came, I stood up there, looked out at my classmates, and just started talking. And you know what? It wasn't perfect. I stumbled over a couple of words, and there was a moment where I lost my train of thought. But I kept going. I didn't freeze up like I would have in the past. And afterward, when the teacher complimented me on how clear and confident I was, I couldn't believe it. I had come so far. But even beyond the classroom, English was becoming this powerful tool that opened doors for me. One of the coolest experiences I had was when I got the chance to attend an international summer camp. There were kids from all over the world, each with their own native language. But the common thread was English. It was the first time I really felt the global impact of learning this language. Suddenly, I wasn't just talking to people from my school or my neighborhood. I was having conversations with people from different countries, learning about their cultures, their ideas, and their perspectives, all through English. That camp was a game changer. I met this kid from Japan named Hiro, and we hit it off right away. Now, Hiro didn't speak my first language, and I didn't speak Japanese, so English became our only way to communicate. We spent hours talking about everything from video games to the differences between our country's schools. And it wasn't just Hiro. I made friends with people from Germany, Brazil, South Africa. It felt like the whole world had suddenly opened up to me, all because I could speak English. What really stuck with me was the realization that language isn't just about words and grammar. It's about connection. It's about understanding people who are different from you and being understood in return. And that's when I knew learning English wasn't just a skill. It was a superpower. After that camp, I felt like there was no stopping me. I started looking for more ways to challenge myself. I joined the school debate team, which I never would have done before. I mean, can you imagine? Standing up in front of people, not just talking, but arguing in English? It was terrifying at first, but it ended up being one of the best decisions I made. Debating forced me to think fast, to organize my thoughts, and to speak with confidence, even when I didn't feel like I had all the right words. And let me tell you, the first time I won an argument against a native English speaker, I felt like I was on top of the world. But even after all those milestones, presentations, debates, making international friends, I think the moment that hit me the hardest was something much simpler. I was walking home from school one day, just thinking about random stuff, when I realized that my thoughts were in English. I wasn't translating anymore, not even in my own head. I was just thinking in English, naturally, without effort. It was like I had crossed some invisible line. English wasn't just a foreign language I had to work at. It had become a part of how I saw the world. It sounds small, but that realization was huge for me. It meant I had reached a level of comfort with the language that I never thought possible. And it wasn't just about the words. It was about the culture, the humor, the way people communicate in subtle ways. I had started to understand not just the language, but the way people use it, how they express their personalities through it. But here's the funny thing. I'm still learning. I don't think you ever really stop. Even now, I come across new words, new slang, or new ways of saying things that surprise me. Just the other day, I learned the phrase, spill the tea, which apparently means to gossip. Who comes up with this stuff? But that's what makes it fun. There's always something new to discover, something that keeps you on your toes. Looking back, I think the biggest lesson I've learned through all of this is that language isn't just a skill you can measure in terms of fluency. It's a journey, one that changes you in ways you don't expect. It's not just about speaking the words. It's about learning to think differently, to see the world from a new perspective. And most importantly, it's about connecting with people, understanding them, and letting them understand you. So yeah, that's how I became fluent in English. And if you're on your own language learning journey, here's what I want to leave you with. Take it one step at a time. It's okay to struggle, to make mistakes, and to feel frustrated. Trust me, I've been there. But keep going. Celebrate the small wins. The first time you order food without panicking. The first time you understand a joke. The first time you dream in English. Because those small wins add up, and one day you'll look back, just like I am now, and realize that you've come further than you ever thought possible.
Sarah's story, her journey to fluency in English. Hey, I'm Sarah. You've probably heard about my friend Alex and how he became fluent in English, right? Well, what you might not know is that my story isn't all that different from his. We both started in the same place, struggling, feeling lost, and wondering if we'd ever be able to speak English like everyone around us. But I think what's cool is that even though we were on the same journey, our experiences were a little different. So here's my side of the story. Let's rewind a bit. Like Alex, I wasn't always living in an English-speaking country. I grew up in a place where English was just something we learned in school. Nothing more, nothing less. To be honest, I never really thought about it outside of class. It was just another subject, something to memorize for tests. But then, everything changed when my family moved. I still remember that feeling of panic when I realized we'd be living in a place where I'd have to speak English every day. Suddenly, English wasn't just a subject anymore. It was my life. My first few days at my new school, a disaster. I couldn't understand half of what my teachers were saying, and when I tried to talk to other kids, I froze. My mind would go blank, and I'd end up just nodding or smiling awkwardly. The worst part? Everyone seemed so confident, so fluent. I felt like I was a million miles behind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch up. But here's the thing. Just like Alex, I realized pretty quickly that I had two choices. I could either stay quiet and hide behind my fear, or I could put myself out there and start using English no matter how bad I was at first. And yeah, I chose the second option. Was it scary? Absolutely, but I knew that the only way to get better was to try. I'll never forget the first time I actually had a conversation with someone at school. Her name was Emma, and she sat next to me in math class. We had been sitting there for weeks without talking, mostly because I was too nervous to start a conversation. But one day, she turned to me and asked if I understood the homework. Now, old Sarah would have just nodded and pretended everything was fine, but I didn't want to do that anymore. So I took a deep breath and said, "Not really. Can you help me?" And that was it. That one sentence opened up a whole conversation. Emma was super patient with me, explaining the math problems slowly and even helping me with some of the words I didn't know. We ended up talking for the rest of the class, and by the end of it, I felt like I had taken a huge step forward. It wasn't just that I had spoken in English, it was that I had connected with someone. I wasn't just the quiet new girl anymore. I was part of the conversation. After that, I started pushing myself to talk more. I wasn't perfect, of course. I still made tons of mistakes. There was this one time I accidentally said kitchen instead of chicken when I was ordering lunch in the cafeteria. Yeah, that got me some weird looks. But you know what? I laughed it off. I was learning, and every mistake was just part of the process. One thing that really helped me was finding things I actually enjoyed doing in English, Like, I've always been a huge fan of music, so I started listening to English songs. At first, I'd look up the lyrics and try to understand what they meant. Slowly but surely, I started picking up new words and phrases. There was this one song I loved, and I played it over and over again until I could sing every word without messing up. It sounds silly, but it was such a confidence boost. It made me feel like, hey, I can do this. But music wasn't the only thing that helped. I also got into reading, something I never thought I'd say, by the way. Before, the only English books I ever touched were the ones we had to read for school, and I found them so boring. But one day, my teacher recommended this novel that wasn't part of the curriculum. It was just a fun, light-hearted story about a girl my age navigating life in high school. I decided to give it a shot, and honestly, I was hooked. The language was simple enough for me to follow, but challenging enough that I learned new words along the way. Plus, the story was relatable, and I could see myself in the main character. Reading that book was a game changer. It made me realize that English wasn't just something I had to learn for school. It was a tool, a way for me to experience stories, music, and ideas from all over the world. And the more I read, the easier it became to understand not just the words, but the way people thought in English. That was huge for me. But let's be real. There were still moments when I felt totally out of my depth. Like, there was this one time we had to write an essay for English class. I spent hours on it, trying to make sure everything was perfect. I thought I had done pretty well, but when I got the paper back, there were red marks all over it. Grammar mistakes, awkward phrasing, you name it. I was so disappointed. I remember thinking, will I ever get this right? That's when Alex stepped in. We had become friends by then, and he knew exactly how I felt. He told me about his own struggles with writing in English and how he had made a ton of mistakes too. But instead of letting it get to him, he used those mistakes as a way to learn. That stuck with me. So instead of feeling sorry for myself, I went back to my essay, looked at the corrections, and figured out what I could do better next time. And guess what? My next paper wasn't perfect either, but it was a lot better. As time went on, I started noticing little victories, like I could follow conversations without having to translate everything in my head, or I could watch a movie without subtitles and actually understand most of it. I even started dreaming in English, just like Alex had mentioned. That was weird at first, but also kind of awesome. There was this one day that really stands out to me, though. We had a group project in history class, and our teacher paired me up with 2 native speakers. I was nervous at first. What if I couldn't keep up? What if they thought I was slowing them down? But instead of doubting myself, I jumped in. I contributed ideas, asked questions, and even led part of the presentation. And when it was all over, one of my group members turned to me and said, "Wow, your English is really good." That might not seem like a big deal, but for me it was everything. It was the moment I realized I wasn't just surviving in English, I was thriving. I had come a long way from that shy, nervous girl who didn't know what to say. I was confident, and I was proud of how far I'd come. So yeah, my journey to fluency wasn't easy. There were plenty of bumps along the way, and I definitely had my fair share of embarrassing moments. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Every mistake I made, every awkward conversation I had, brought me one step closer to where I am today. And just like Alex said, fluency isn't a destination. It's a journey, one that never really ends. Even now, I'm still learning new things, still pushing myself to get better, But the difference is, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm excited about it. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there even when you're scared, because those are the moments when you grow the most. And who knows, maybe one day you'll look back just like I am now and realize how far you've come. After that moment when my classmate told me my English was good, something changed in me. I realized that the fear I had about not being perfect in English was really just in my head. Sure, I still made mistakes here and there, but that's part of the process, right? Even native speakers mess up sometimes. It's not about being flawless, it's about communicating, about being understood and understanding others. I started to see English as something fun, something that could take me places. I remember how before I used to dread participating in class or even speaking up in casual conversations. Now it was different. I found myself volunteering to read out loud in class, giving presentations without feeling that gut-wrenching anxiety, and even cracking jokes in English. Okay, maybe my humor didn't always land, but hey, I was trying, and the more I tried, the more I felt like I was becoming a part of this new world around me. One thing I really started to enjoy was helping others who were struggling with English too. See, there were a few new kids in school just like I had been, and I could see that look in their eyes, the same one I had when I first arrived. Lost, unsure, and maybe a little scared. So I made it a point to talk to them, to share my own experience, and to let them know that it gets easier. I mean, if I could get through it, so could they, right? One girl in particular, her name was Leah, reminded me so much of myself when I first started. She was quiet, always sitting in the back of the classroom, never raising her hand. I could tell she understood a little English, but speaking it? That was a different story. I knew that feeling all too well, the fear of sounding wrong, of embarrassing yourself. One day after class, I walked up to her and said, "Hey, you're doing great. If you ever want to practice speaking, we can talk." She gave me this shy smile, like she wasn't sure if I was serious, but after a few days, she took me up on my offer. We started small, just having short conversations, talking about easy things like our favorite music or what we like to do on the weekends. It reminded me of how Emma had helped me in those early days, and now here I was, helping someone else. Leah started to come out of her shell bit by bit. I could see her confidence growing with each conversation, just like mine had. It felt good, you know, like everything I had struggled through was worth it if it meant I could help someone else. But let's rewind a little. There's something else I haven't talked about yet: my family. See, learning English wasn't just happening at school, it was happening at home, too. My parents didn't speak much English, so a lot of the time I found myself acting as the translator. At first, I didn't think much of it. I would help them order food at restaurants or explain things we got in the mail. But as my English improved, I realized how much I was taking on. It wasn't just small tasks anymore. I was helping them with bank paperwork, doctor's appointments, even translating phone calls. To be honest, it was a lot of pressure. I remember feeling like I had to be perfect, because if I messed up, it wouldn't just affect me. It could cause problems for my whole family. But over time, I got better at it. I learned how to communicate more clearly, how to ask the right questions, and how to explain complicated things in simple ways. It was tough, but it also made me realize how much I had grown. I had gone from barely being able to understand English to navigating adult conversations on behalf of my parents. There was one time that really stood out. My mom had a doctor's appointment, and the doctor was explaining a new treatment plan to her. He was speaking quickly, using all this medical jargon that was hard to follow, even for me. But instead of panicking, I asked him to slow down, and I repeated everything back to make sure I understood. I translated it for my mom, and afterward, she looked at me with so much pride in her eyes. That was a huge moment for me. It wasn't just about the language anymore. It was about responsibility, about being able to take care of the people I love. Of course, there were still plenty of moments where I felt overwhelmed, balancing school, helping my family, and trying to keep up with everything wasn't always easy, but every challenge made me stronger. I started to realize that learning a language wasn't just about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. It was about growing as a person, learning to adapt, and finding your own voice in a new language. And then, there were the fun moments. Like when Alex and I would hang out and just talk about how far we'd come. We'd laugh about the mistakes we used to make, the times we confused words or didn't understand cultural references. But what was even better was how we started to mix English and our native language in our conversations. We'd switch back and forth without even thinking about it. It was like we had created our own way of communicating, something that was totally unique to us. I also started to watch a lot more English TV shows and movies. At first, I needed subtitles, but after a while, I challenged myself to turn them off. It wasn't easy, but it was kind of like a game. I'd try to see how much I could understand without needing to pause or look things up. And you know what? I surprised myself. I was getting better, faster, and before I knew it, I could watch a whole movie and understand almost everything. It felt like I had unlocked a new level. And then, of course, there were the moments where I realized just how global English is. Alex and I used to talk about how English opened up the world for us, and he was right. I remember one day I joined an online group where people from all over the world came together to share their art. There were people from Japan, Brazil, France, Nigeria. It was incredible. And guess what? We all communicated in English. That's when it really hit me. English wasn't just a school subject or a means of survival. It was a bridge, connecting me to people I never would have met otherwise. I still think about that sometimes, about how different my life would be if I hadn't pushed myself to learn. I wouldn't have had half the opportunities I've had or made the friends I've made, and honestly, I wouldn't be the person I am today. Fluency isn't just about speaking another language, it's about learning to see the world in a whole new way. So, that's my story. Just like Alex, I went from feeling completely lost to finding my voice. It wasn't easy and there were a lot of tough moments along the way, but looking back, every struggle, every awkward conversation, and every mistake was worth it, because now I'm fluent, not just in English, but in confidence, in connection, and in the belief that I can overcome anything. And if I can do it, so can you.